Welcome everyone to the Newburyport Literary Festival. We are so pleased that we're able to bring you all of these events online in this time of quarantine. I want to also thank A Mighty Blaze for hosting us on Facebook today. We are currently live streaming this event. You'll notice in the chat, I have put a little note about the independent bookstores that are partnering with us today. So if you're interested in Adrienne's book or any of the books that are part of the festival, please consider buying them at an indie bookstore. We are calling out in particular Jabberwocky Books here in Newburyport and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. We are in a webinar, so everyone is on mute. And we'd like to ask that if you have questions for Adrienne, that you use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're free to use the chat for conversation, but please use the Q&A for questions for the author. So I'd like to get us started and introduce our moderator, Meg Mitchell Moore. Meg is the author of 5 novels, and her 6th novel, Two Truths and a Lie, will be out in May 2020. Her 2019 novel, The Islanders, was named one of 8 great summer reads by the New York Times. And her previous books have been featured in Entertainment Weekly, People, and on the television show The View. She lives in Newburyport with her husband, 3 teenage daughters, and a very beautiful golden retriever.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Adrienne, for being here. And I repeat everything Jen said about we're so excited to be able to bring this to everybody online. We have about half an hour for this session, and I probably have 7 hours worth of questions for Adrienne. So I'm going to ask questions for about 20 minutes, and then I will take the questions that have come in on the Q&A. So we're so happy to have Adrienne Brodeur here. She's the author of this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful memoir called Wild Game: My Mother, Her Lover, and Me, which came out in October, I think, or this fall. Was
yes.
it October?
October.
Yeah, in October, to huge acclaim. It really is a beautiful book, and for anybody who hasn't read it yet, you want to after hearing her speak. And I know a lot of you listening and watching probably have read it. Adrienne is also the executive director of Aspen Words, a literary arts nonprofit and program of the Aspen Institute. And I'm just going to read the book jacket description because that does the best job of saying what this book is about for those who might not know. And then I have lots of questions. So I'll see what I get through, and then we'll take your questions. And then I know those of you who haven't read the book are going to run right out and buy it at one of the 2 independent bookstores that Jen just mentioned. On a hot July night on Cape Cod, when Adrienne was 14, her mother, Malabar, woke her at midnight with 5 simple words that would set the course of both of their lives for years to come. Then Souther just kissed me. Adrienne instantly became her mother's confidant and helpmate, blossoming in the sudden light of her attention. And from then on, Malabar came to rely on her daughter to help orchestrate what would become an epic affair with her husband's closest friend. The affair would have calamitous consequences for everyone involved, impacting Adrienne's life in profound ways, driving her into a precarious marriage of her own and then into a deep depression. Only years later will she find the strength to embrace her life and her mother on her own terms. So there we have it. Now, Adrienne, my first question. The story spans so many years. It began when you were 14 years old and really ends, for the most part, when your daughter was born in 2005. And your mother is still alive, correct?
Correct.
And I don't know how long it took you to write this, but at what point did you say, okay, I'm ready to tell this story?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you for interviewing me. Hello. And thank you for having me, Newburyport Book Festival. You know, with Memoir, the processing is part of the work. So I could answer it by saying 40 years, but the actual writing time itself took more like 2.5 or 3. But I think with Memoir, ultimately, it's not about the events of your life, although obviously they're very important. It's about your consciousness about those events. And sometimes you really do require a lot of time to understand what you've gone through and what's happened to you. And because this happened, or this occurred, the pivotal moment occurred when I was only 14, it was almost part of my growing up and part of who I was. So it took a long time for me to understand all the ways in which it sort of tentacles had rooted their way into me.
Right, right. And 2.5 years, you said, or so it took you to write it?
About that. I mean, once I sat down, once I understood that memoir was the way I wanted to write it, and I think at different points in time, I noodled around in the territory a lot. I mean, I tried to write it as a romantic comedy at one point in time. Like, I did all sorts of crazy avoidant things. I think sometimes we use humor because it sort of deflects or masks pain. But once I realized this is the way I need to tell this story straightforwardly in memoir, a true reckoning, then it happened quite quickly. I mean, if you consider 2.5 years quickly, but maybe.
No, I do. And I think a lot of writers who are listening would as well. And it is just, what I loved, and we'll get to this a little bit later, is one of the reviews, I think it was the Publishers Weekly review, said that it's a memoir that reads like heady beach fiction, which I think is such a perfect description. It really, I mean, it is a page-turning memoir, and that is really unusual. I'm so glad you wrote it this way, but it also almost reads like fiction in a really wonderful way.
Well, thank you. I definitely, I mean, mostly I've been a fiction editor in my life. And so I definitely, as I wrote it, I was aware of wanting to wanting to show it in scenes, I guess is the best way of putting it. Which isn't to say in my first draft, there wasn't a whole lot of explaining and this is when this emotion hit and that struck and so on. But I ended up excising a lot of that and just trying to really show the events that happened and let readers draw their own conclusion until a later point in the book when I kind of brought my consciousness more to bear.
Right. Yes. Well, the pacing is just phenomenal. I really admire that. Now, I know that we have daughters who are close in age. My middle daughter and your daughter are the same grade. I don't know if my daughter's 15 now. I don't know if your daughter's still 14 or if she's turned 15 yet.
She's turning 15 this summer, so she's still 14.
Okay. So this is fascinating. She is right at the age that you were when your mother first woke you up and you became ensnared in her affair. And what I loved so much about your book is when you get to the end and you write so movingly about becoming a mother yourself and all of the fear that's associated with that for you, and the collective history of your female lineage, and if that's escapable or can you break that chain. And then when you realize that you can, that's such a powerful moment. So my question is, what about motherhood has surprised you the most from that moment when you first held your newborn daughter to where you are now looking back and she's the age that you were when the story started?
That is such an enormous question because, of course, everything changes when you have children. And I think above all, having children just brings up so much that's unexpected. It lets you actually appreciate how much work you took for granted, that your parents, even if your parents weren't perfect, they did. Just sort of keeping you alive each and every day is no small thing. But I think having children is revelatory. I mean, it's this moment where you rethink everything. And at that point in time, which was 14 years ago, I think I thought I had a pretty solid grip on the events of my life. And there was a moment immediately after giving birth, when I mean, elevator doors open, I was wheeled out, I'd just given birth, I had my baby in my arms, and there was my mother, who I had been so excited to introduce to her first grandchild. And I had the most physical reaction, in as much as I felt like there was a weight on my chest. I stopped being able to speak. Like, I saw her and I was starting to speak, and then I just couldn't. I was gasping for air. My heart started racing. My face turned red. And this very efficient breast nurse kind of put her back in her place and took me into the other room. And when she sort of commanded me to breathe, and when I finally kind of got myself together, I said, what just happened? And she kind of said, there's anesthesia, and there you had an anxiety attack. And I just thought, no. Like, it felt like my past and my future had just like had this collision. And I thought, I have so much work to do. Above all, I didn't want to repeat the mistakes. I didn't want this legacy of secret keeping and deception to continue. And it was just a powerful moment of awakening. And then to answer your question about my daughter being 14, I mean, I think the most striking thing about that has been for me that I only used to understand what it meant to be a 14-year-old as a 14-year-old, which of course I thought I knew everything at 14. I thought I was in complete control and understood the world, and probably more than I do now. And of course, witnessing a 14-year-old, and my daughter's wonderful and mature and graceful and everything else, but she's also still a child. And that has been amazing to witness, especially as the book came out, realizing that I was such a child at the time, that despite my memory of sort of being her collaborator and being her best friend and being all these things, like, really how sort of corrupt those memories are in some ways.
Right, because it's such an in-between age, 13, 14, even 15. You are a child and you're turning into an adult, but you're not there yet. So you were thrust into this adult world when you, as you said, you were still a child.
And it was very seductive, of course. Like, can you imagine something kind of more thrilling than being invited by the person you trust most, by your very sort of, I don't know, exotic mother, into this such a grown-up world? I mean, I was ready to, sort of throw all the friends behind and just jump on board, which is what I did.
Right, and so glamorous, and yeah, I mean, the descriptions of your mother and the way she looked and her cooking, it is so seductive as a reader. I can imagine living through it. It was 1,000 times that. Speaking of the food, well, I don't know where to go next, the food or Cape Cod. I think I'll go to Cape Cod, but in so many ways, what I love about this book is it's about the love between mother and daughter and between your mother and her lover, but it's also a real love story to Cape Cod, which I love. I have a lot of memories there myself. My grandmother had a house there and we spent a lot of time there. So it's such an important part and just such a New England book in that way, which I really love. And I'm just curious what your now family's relationship is to the Cape. I think you still go back and forth.
We do. And I have to say, I still get the same feeling a million years later, driving over that bridge. It's like my pulse slows down, the salty air. We all love it. I have been fortunate enough to always be in a profession where I could travel and be where, I could edit wherever I was and so on. And so since my children have been born, we've spent some chunk of every summer there, and we do the same things I did as a child. We go clamming and fishing, and we grow tomatoes, and just, it's just such a rich, beautiful place with, you see whales and sharks and every other kind of marine life. It's just, I love it. It's wonderful. It's my happy place.
There's that particular smell that no other place smells like Cape Cod. It really
Art.
is. I love it.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that plays such a big part in the book is food, and Wild Game is the title of the cookbook that your mother and her lover were ostensibly working on for a long time as they conducted their affair. And the descriptions of food are phenomenal. I think I told you in one of our emails, I don't even eat meat, and my mouth was still watering reading all of these descriptions. And they were really exotic dishes, and people were hunting their own food and breaking the birds and all that sorts of things. So I'm curious now if you are a big cook yourself, and how much of a role that plays in your own life.
Well, I love to cook. I grew up, obviously with Malabar at the helm, and she was a fantastic cook, and fantastic before she ever entered the wild game scene. She had, she studied at Le Cordon Bleu, and she, my whole childhood, she was testing recipes she had a food column for the Boston Globe, and she wrote all sorts of cookbooks. And then it was because her lover was an avid recreational hunter and fisherman that they sort of concocted this idea, because they were couple friends too, of how to get the couples together regularly, and they created this cookbook. But yeah, I am definitely one of those people who is, always thinking about my next meal. We strive for perfect bites in my household. I don't understand the people who don't think much of food or can skip meals. It's not in my DNA. That said, I'm not the chef that my mother was. I mean, she had one of those abilities. She could taste a sauce in a restaurant, and like detect that hidden ingredient, you know, little whiff of cardamom or something. And then the next day she could also recreate it in her own kitchen. I mean, that is not my skill set, but I can do well. I can
Yeah,
put together a good meal.
sure you can pull a meal together. That's great. Um, I know that the paperback of Wild Game was supposed to be released, I think, in May and has moved to July as so many things have changed with the coronavirus. And I love that description that I talked about from Publishers Weekly about it being a phenomenal beach read. I hope that it's in everybody's beach bag this summer if there are beaches and bags this summer. Do you have a summer reading list yourself, or do you want to tell us about what you're reading now?
Oh, I just finished Writers and Lovers by Lily King, which I loved. I have not gotten so far ahead as to have a summer beach read list, and I, you know, you've suggested it, and I will get on it. I think one of the things that I will say that I've heard from a lot of readers is that I'm just now getting back into the groove. Like, it was such a distracting situation initially, you know, this whole social isolating and so on, that I always finish books, and I must have started 5 books and not because they weren't great books, but just couldn't kind of hang on to them. And so now I'm sort of delighted to be getting back in the groove and really finding things that I enjoy. So I will also look at this list of writers and check out lots of their work as well.
Heard that from a lot of people about the trouble. Writers and Lovers, it's funny, it's the book I was reading right when this all hit, and I flew right through that because I loved it, but I've heard from a lot of people that they have started things and not finished them, or it's you have all this time but you don't have the concentration. Either your house is too full or your mind is too full, and it's tricky. It's really tricky.
It's been a strange, obviously a strange
Right.
time for all of us.
Right. But I will say, I have recommended your book to so many people, and those who haven't read it yet, I'm sure will pick it up in paperback because I think it is that very rare memoir that is a beach read too. It can be a beach read too.
Thank you. One of the other things that's been unexpectedly fun has been zooming into book clubs, which is obviously far easier than physically getting to them. And it never was something sort of I had on the radar, and people would just direct message me on Instagram. And so suddenly I've been doing this and I really enjoy it.
Yeah,
so anyone who wants me to zoom in, please let me know.
Yes, I'm sure you'll get a lot of takers on that. I haven't done that much of that myself, but now I'm so much more comfortable with the format. I think I will going forward because.
Well, you'll have to with your new book.
Right, exactly. It's that or nothing. I have one more question, and then I think it's probably going to be time to go to the Q&A on the site. So there's one scene where you that really struck me, where you were in your apartment in New York when you were just moving in, and your mother spoke some harsh words to you, and you said something, actually I wrote it here, given all the compliments and kind words my mother has said to me in her lifetime, and there have been many, it seems unfair that my brain formed such a deep wrinkle around this particular sentence. Why is it that an insult stays with you forever, whereas love and praise passes through you like water through a sieve? I thought that was so beautiful. And I also thought it was so applicable to writing and reading, reviews of.
Yes, 10,000 nice reviews and one bad, and it's the only one you remember.
I have them all memorized. I have the bad ones memorized, and the good ones have gone right out. So I'm curious if you do that as a writer as well.
Well, I asked my publishing people, my family, not to send me anything terrible. I found it, I knew it would derail me in some ways. And I think with memoir in particular, you feel so vulnerable because it's not just your writing and your story that's being analyzed, it's your life. And I think it's brave to write any book, but it definitely was really hard, especially in the beginning, before I sort of accepted the fact, which I think everyone has to accept, all writers have to accept that, and it's a great thing. Once you write a book, you have absolutely no power over how it's read, nor should you. So that some people can read my book and think, wow, Malabar, a force of nature, a feminist before her time, which isn't exactly what I thought. Or others can be like, wow, Malabar, what the most evil of all mothers. Also not my opinion, but that all these things are valid and fair. And it really says so much more about the reader and their own lens than, you know what you wrote in your book, what you meant. but you can't, it's like an alive creature. I mean, it brings out different things in different people, and that's the purpose of art.
It's true. That's very well said. And I'm going to keep that in mind because I struggle with that too. I think all writers do. And I can imagine it's so much harder with memoir than it is with fiction, but thank you for that. All right, I'm going to pull out the Q&A here and see what we have for questions. And I know Jen is here to help if we need it, but I'll see what I can do first. Somebody wants to know if your mother read Wild Game.
That's a good question. My mother, around 5 years ago, when I really understood that I was going to be writing it as memoir, I told her that I was going to be doing it as such, and she was supportive. I mean, it wasn't like she did a happy dance, but she was a great chronicler of her own life, and she directed me towards a lot of scrapbooks and material she had. So it was all very helpful. That said, my mother has become gravely ill in the last few years. So when I was writing it, I certainly read pieces of it aloud to her. I mean, she has not been able to read the final book, and honestly, it's no part of our relationship anymore. She's not in good shape. And when I'm with her, it's just to give care and love.
Right. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm also happy that you can be there for her, as I'm sure you are too. Somebody else wanted to know what about the other people in your life who are featured in the book? Have they been supportive?
Yeah, I mean, I've been surprised by how supportive everyone has been. I was initially most concerned, I should back up and say, this was not a tell-all. Like, I was not outing my mother or telling anyone in the book, like my father or brother or ex-husband, stuff they didn't know. I mean, that secret came out long, long, long ago. So it wasn't that. I think people didn't know the level of my involvement, but the people I was actually worried about were sort of the next tier out, my step siblings from my first stepfather, my step siblings from my second stepfather, just because, it just felt like not everyone would want their past dredged up, even though they weren't part of the book, which is also why, despite the fact that anyone can find out names by Googling me, I didn't choose to use any names. I gave each character a different name other than their own, except for my mother, Malabar, my father, and myself.
Right. Thank you. And one question is, what was your path to publication like, getting an agent and publisher? I know you've been in the literary world for a long time. Did you have to take some of the traditional routes to publication?
I mean, it's always the traditional route. You always need to find an agent who feels passionately about the book and sell it. Like, I had no inside, that said, I knew all those people. I know people at different publishing houses, and I know agents. And so, in that way, it wasn't as confusing or Byzantine as I think it is for people from other industries, other parts of the world or country, who are just like, how do I get someone in New York City to know me? So I was fortunate in that way.
Right. Let's see. Here's a good question. Do you feel that you lost part of your childhood in this experience, and how did this impact your teenage relationships?
It's so hard to say because, of course, we all only get one life. And so just the concept of like having lost something, I mean, I guess the long story short is I feel really happy in my life right now, and I have for many years. I'm happily married. I have a beautiful family, 2 children, lovely stepchildren. So the fear is always like, if you didn't start there, you wouldn't get here. And so in that way, I don't want to change a thing. But, was it difficult and challenging? Sure. But we all go through difficult and challenging things.
Right. Somebody would like to know what your relationship with your father was like.
My relationship with my father has always been pretty good. He is, they were divorced in the 70s. So, it was a very different every other weekend, there were different expectations on fathers. It wasn't like he and I were like that. And also it was a secret I was keeping from my mother, because people often ask, like, did I feel compelled to tell my father? I mean, he would be the last person I would disclose something about his ex-wife to, simply because they were sort of predisposed not to get along. And so I avoided, anything that would exacerbate that situation.
Right. Great. Thank you. I really liked the scene when you talked about walking down the aisle of your first wedding with your father. He seemed very, very sweet. Like,
he's got a charming side.
Somebody, I just lost it here, but I know it was somebody asking what you're working on now. Are you working on any fiction by any chance, or do you stick with memoir from here?
I think I will be leaving the territory of memoir for a while. I have a novel idea that I'm only just starting to noodle around in, but I'm actually at that very early point of kind of obsession I'm really interested in. And though I haven't done much writing yet, I'm just sort of constantly swirling in the territory and figuring out the characters. So it's fun.
That's a nice stage. I like that. I like that stage where it seems like it's the best book that was ever written, before you start writing. It's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
I would love to see what you have for fiction up your sleeve. Oh yeah, this is a good question that I meant to ask, which is, what is the status of the movie adaptation of your book? I know it was optioned for film, right?
It was optioned for film, and it was attached with a wonderful writer-director who I've been working with. And, I've seen a lovely first draft, and I'd say the best part of it for me is that the film has changed so much from the book that it feels, I know some people would think that felt terrible, but I think it feels wonderful for me, because the writer-director explained how essentially, there are these requirements to, this is a different art. I didn't want to be wasn't trying to maintain control over it. It's, what I did in 250 pages, she's supposed to do in an hour and a half. When I went all over the country to Hawaii and California and New York and Massachusetts, she's constricted by geography. So the story is actually quite different. It takes place only on the Cape. And so far I love it. I don't really get too involved, because it's sort of, in stages of development where the producers are asking for revisions and so on. And I kind of think it's not a film until you walk down the red carpet, because for everyone who has a movie, I know so few that have actually been made. So I'm excited. But temper.
Yeah, no, I think that's smart, but I feel good about it. Are there actors attached yet?
No.
Oh, do you
Not
have?
that I know of. I mean, it has a light far beyond what I know, I'm sure, but I don't know anything about it if there are.
Have you cast it in your mind?
Believe it or not, I haven't. And part of that, no one believes me on that, but part of that is I don't watch a ton of movies, or I certainly haven't since I've had children, beyond like the Disneys and so on, a little bit, but not enough. And part of it is I feel like I'm in the hands of such smart experts in their field. It would be like me telling the plumber how to fix the toilet. Like I don't have the first sense of who would be the right person.
Right. Wow.
Plus everyone's so much younger. Like Malabar is younger than I am now in this book. So like the actors I feel most familiar with, or people say, who do I want to play me? And I think, I don't know a 15-year-old actor.
Oh, it's so exciting though. I hope it all keeps going. Let's see. Here is, I think, one last question that we have time for, and it's a heavy one, but I'm going to go with it.
Okay.
Mother struggled with mental illness and was psychologically abusive. I was struck by my mom's ability for forgiveness when I struggled with it on her behalf. What is your daughter's relationship with her grandmother, your mother?
My daughter has a beautiful relationship with her grandmother, and I have always tried to foster and encourage it. It actually is a much different and much more lovely, much lovelier relationship, simply because her grandmother doesn't have power over her the way she did over me. And they just enjoyed each other. They used to do a lot of cooking together and so on. And my daughter, other than me, I'd say my daughter is the person who visits and just sits with her and enjoys her company, even in her diminished state. And so it's very sweet.
Oh, I love that.
It is. It makes me.
The lineage that you talked about and how it can end here, you know, how not end here, but I just love
No,
that
but you
carrying on
change
of
the
it.
story. You change the story in the best possible way, and at least in that score, it has been successful.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think, Jen, are we out of time? I mean, I could keep talking forever, but oh, here's Jen. Hi,
Jen.
Jen.
Yes, we are wrapping up. I guess I do see somebody wrote a question in the chat instead of the Q&A. So let me throw this one to you and then we can wrap up. How do your children feel about your history?
Well, I would say my son, who's only 11, really, it's just like, whoom. I mean, he's much more interested in, other things. And I haven't hidden anything from him, but he's not curious and we don't really talk about it. I'd say with my daughter, in the best possible way, she is a 14-year-old. She has a huge and busy social life, curtailed but not stopped by COVID-19. She seems to live on Zoom chats and still engages with her friends. She loves reading sort of world building fiction, so she's not really that interested in reading an angsty memoir. But she's, I'd say sort of an appropriate interest, but not too concerned with my psychological inner workings, which, given how obsessed I was with my mother's, I also take as a victory.
Oh, I love that.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Adrienne and Meg. You guys, this was really interesting. And there's still so many more questions. I wish we could get to them all.
I know I didn't get all of them. I did what I could.
But I highly recommend the book. So if you have a question, you haven't read the book, go get the book. You will. It is wonderful. And please buy the book at an independent bookstore. We need to keep them alive right now. So
We do.
Thank you so much, everyone. And attendees, I hope that we'll see you at other events. We've got 2 tracks going on all day, so there's a lot more to see this afternoon. And there are more events on Sunday, May 3rd. Thank you very much, everyone.